Moral nihilism. The term nihilism comes from the Latin nihil, which means nothing. Moral nihilism goes beyond moral skepticism because its proponents don't just claim that there's no way to know what's right or wrong, or that there's no way to adjudicate between differing views about morality. They claim that moral facts either aren't real or aren't true. Properly speaking, nothing is good or bad, right or wrong, virtuous, morally obligatory, and so on. To say that some action or person is right or wrong is to speak nonsensically, because actions and people cannot possess these kinds of qualities. Now, the discussion here can take us into some pretty strange territory, philosophically speaking. I myself am not convinced that moral facts can, or should, be regarded as metaphysical realities that exist independent of our minds. To me, that just sounds like a really weird way of characterizing abstract ideas. So I may actually agree somewhat with the nihilists in this respect, and yet I wouldn't call myself a nihilist. It seems to me that one can differentiate between abstract concepts and propositions on the one hand, which have the properties of truth or rightness, and entities that actually exist on the other. Here are two abstract ideas, love and idolatry. And here are two propositions. Loving your neighbor is good, and worshiping idols is a sin. Can these things be said to exist? Well, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that, but I would feel comfortable with saying that they are morally right or true. Moral facts, like other truths, don't seem to be metaphysical realities that exist as part of the furniture of the universe. They aren't real in that respect, and I don't feel like I need to accept that they are in order to hold to a belief in objective morality. I suspect that the reason this kind of issue even comes up is because people are trying to understand morality from a non-theistic or atheistic perspective. If someone believes in God, I don't think the same kind of philosophical problem even arises. As a Christian, I would say that moral facts can be objectively true because certain moral qualities align with the nature or character of God. But they aren't like metaphysical entities that literally exist somewhere in the universe, independent of God. I know that some people will try to respond here by saying that this doesn't get around the so-called Euthyphro dilemma because it just makes morals subjective to God. But God is something quite unique. He's quite different from what you and I are. Nothing exists outside of God or independent of God. And so, with regard to the issue at hand, it wouldn't be possible for someone even to entertain a concept if there were no God. That's because he or she wouldn't exist. That wouldn't be the case if you or I didn't exist. Our existence and the thoughts that we have are contingent on God's existence. But God's existence and the thoughts that God has are not contingent on our existence. So if I choose to affirm some concept, like goodness or love, or some proposition, like idolatry is wrong, then that's obviously a personal and subjective evaluation on my part. But if love is good because it aligns with God's nature or character, and if idolatry is wrong because it denies God's nature, then at least for you and I, creatures of God who exist within God's universe, these are objective truths, because they're true whether or not you and I personally acknowledge them, or whether or not you and I even exist. That's how I understand the matter anyway. But we'll have to explore the whole Euthyphro dilemma in a later lecture. Anyway, it's important to realize that moral nihilism is not the same thing as moral relativism. Moral relativism, whether cultural or subjectivist, is thought to be normative or prescriptive, at least within the culture or for the individual. Nihilism is not. In other words, a relativist system still carries with it certain moral requirements or obligations. Moral nihilism can't prescribe or recommend any action, at least not on the grounds that it's good or bad, right or wrong. Because according to this moral system, an action can't have those kinds of qualities. Now, we can, of course, label some action as good or bad, but in so doing, we aren't actually saying anything true. It would be like calling a pencil wealthy or algebra hot pink. All right, now there are several moral nihilists who I could talk about here. J.L. Mackie, for example, is a fairly contemporary philosopher. He wrote a pretty influential book in the 1970s, and there's an excerpt in your textbook, at least if you have one of the more recent editions. So you're welcome to read that if you're interested in hearing more about nihilism from someone who actually endorses that system. In this lecture, though, I'm going to focus on another nihilist named Friedrich Nietzsche. And if you don't know how to spell Nietzsche, here are some helpful hints. Remember that in German, when you see the vowels I-E, you should always pronounce E, as in Spiel. When you see the vowels E-I, you should pronounce I. And a good way to remember this is with the name Einstein. It's not pronounced Einstein, right? Okay, and then we also have the letters T-Z that go together, as in Sitz im Leben, situation in life, and Blitzkrieg, lightning fast war. And then we have the combination SCH. Just as in English, we've got these words Wiener Schnitzel, or Wiener Schnitzel as we say, or Doberman Pinscher and Schnauzer. These are all German loan words. A few other words that you may or may not be familiar with are Schadenfreude, which refers to the joy that people sometimes get from seeing the misfortune of others. Yes, the Germans have a specific word for that. And they also have this word, Verschlimmbessern, which means to make something worse by honestly trying, but failing to improve it. All right, so now you should know how to spell Nietzsche. So pause the video, close your eyes, and see if you can spell it out. Right, so Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 and died at the very beginning of the 20th century. He was a son of a Lutheran pastor, and so probably for that reason, he had, at least in his early years, some amount of theological training. But really his concentration, his area of study would be the classics. The classics deal with ancient Greek and Roman civilizations, and especially the languages, but also the history, the culture, and such. Nietzsche was deeply influenced by a philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer, who wrote a book called The World as Will and Representation. Now, this is a book about metaphysics. Metaphysics is the study of the nature of reality. Nowadays, I would say that most people would be sort of like materialists or physicalists. So they believe that at base of everything, the substrate of all reality is matter, like particles or atoms. Not so much with Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer believed that everything is ultimately will. So his philosophy is known as voluntarism, from the Latin voluntas, voluntatis, which means will or inclination, desire. Well, that philosophy really had an influence on Nietzsche. Another big influence was D.F. Strauss's book, The Life of Jesus. This book called into question the historicity of Jesus' miracles. Now, here you have to understand a little bit about what was going on in biblical scholarship at the time. Outside of the academy, there were, of course, lots of Christians who still believed in the historicity of the miracles. So, for example, Jesus stilling the sea or walking on the water or healing various people. But within the academy, rationalism was the philosophy of the day. And so rationalistic interpretations of Jesus' miracles were very much in vogue. And so, for example, the miracle of Jesus walking on the water these scholars would have said it wasn't really that he was walking on water. It's just that from the angle at which the disciples were watching, it appeared that he was walking on water, when in fact he was just walking on a sandbar. Or another story about the demoniac that is healed. He falls to the ground and he's kind of convulsing and foaming at the mouth. The rationalists would say, yeah, this was really just kind of like an epileptic fit or something. And his epileptic fit came to an end just as Jesus said, come out of the man. So it's kind of a nice coincidence there. Well, D.F. Strauss didn't agree with this line of interpretation. He thought that the miracles were simply mythological, that they were told in order to make a point, perhaps to show that Jesus was the Messiah, or to promote some other early Christian idea. Okay, and then another very important book would be Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, because this book, probably more than anything, convinced Nietzsche that there is no God. Humans were not the creation of an intelligent God. They came into existence through processes that were purely natural, that is to say, unintelligent and purposeless. Some other folks that really had an influence on Nietzsche were Richard Wagner, the famous composer, and his wife Cosima and their friends known as the Wagnerites. These people were very free in their morals, Nietzsche thought. I don't know what that means exactly. Maybe because they were so wealthy, they were able to live quite extravagant or luxurious lives, and they didn't really care what other people thought about it. They just would live it up and drink and party. Or maybe in terms of their sexuality, they engaged in certain practices that went against the norms of society, and that sort of thing. In any case, the Wagners and the Wagnerites had quite an impact on Nietzsche. And Nietzsche was also very struck by the moral ideals that he found in the Homeric literature and in Roman culture. Remember that Nietzsche was a classic scholar, so this was kind of his world. What impressed him so much about the Greek and Roman traditions was the exuberant vitality, the zeal for conquest, and self-confidence, rather than things like self-renunciation, deference to authority, and humility, which were some of the cherished virtues of Europe and Western civilization more generally. And I'll have more to say about that in just a minute, but let me just say something first about Nietzsche's technique in doing philosophy. Nietzsche is often referred to as the philosopher of the hammer, and that's because he really went on the attack and tried to destroy many of the revered philosophers of his day and many of the revered philosophers of the past. And it's quite funny sometimes. He tries to psychoanalyze people. So someone like Immanuel Kant, who was well known as having this very structured daily life. It was like a very predictable routine that he followed every day. He'd wake up at a certain time, he'd eat his breakfast, then he'd go for a walk. People would say that you could actually set your watch by where he was located during his walks. He led a very disciplined, a very structured and highly regimented life. So, not surprisingly, what we find in his philosophy is a very carefully organized moral system, one that's chock full of obligations and duties. Nietzsche saw this as just Kant's own boring personality coming through, and one that he's now trying to project onto others. Okay, so Nietzsche may come off as quite cynical or jaded, but he thought that one should always read the philosophers, or anyone else for that matter, with a hermeneutic of suspicion, knowing that everyone is driven in some way by a primal instinct, something that he referred to as a will to power. Okay, so always be suspicious of other people when they try to tell you something, when they're trying to get you to behave in a certain way or believe in a certain way. Always question their motives. All right, so a major theme of Nietzsche's philosophy is this idea of the will to power. Nietzsche believed that philosophy is incapable of helping us arrive at the first principles of our reasoning. First principles are sort of like your beginning assumptions, things that supposedly everyone can take for granted, things like self-existence or the belief in an external world, the autonomy of human reason, or the notion that goodness and truth are things that we ought to be pursuing. Nietzsche said that this is all nonsense. Nobody engages in philosophy with just a few basic principles, much less as a blank slate. In fact, it's impossible to engage in philosophy without bringing in a whole host of presuppositions and biases. Most of these are unacknowledged, but people bring them in anyway. They smuggle them in, you might say. And that's what makes philosophy so deceptive and so self-deluding. So as it turns out, everyone is just trying to impose his or her will on others. Philosophers aren't any different in this respect. They're just better at masking this and pretending to be dispassionately seeking after the truth or seeking after the good or whatever. So if you can cut through all of their rhetoric and obfuscation, you'll see philosophers for what they truly are. You'll see that they're really just a bunch of phonies. When they claim to be speaking on behalf of others, or when they claim to be pursuing the truth in some impartial or dispassionate way, they're either not being very self-aware, or they're just being dishonest. Nietzsche characterizes philosophers as advocates, lawyers. Lawyers aren't interested in getting at the truth. They're kind of like the sophists. You remember the sophists that Socrates despised so much? They weren't interested in the pursuit of truth or goodness either. They were just interested in persuading people. And unlike philosophers, they were pretty upfront about this. They even bragged that they could defend any position, no matter how absurd, and make it sound credible. Well, the task of a lawyer isn't too far removed from that of the ancient sophist. Lawyers aren't concerned with whether or not their clients are innocent. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. For them, that doesn't really matter. Their task is simply to defend their clients by convincing the jury of their innocence, or at least to convince the jury that the evidence doesn't suffice to convict. And so this is how Nietzsche saw philosophers. They've all got vested interests, unspoken agendas. And those self-interests and unspoken agendas are really the things that are driving them. Sure, they dress it up and make it sound like it's something more sincere, something more honorable, more noble. They talk about things like truth, goodness, objectivity, reason, and all the rest. But in the end, they're just putting lipstick on a pig. They're trying to conceal their true motivation, which is to impose their will on others. It's important, therefore, to read philosophers, as I said, with a hermeneutic of suspicion, not just to take them at their word, but to try to discover their unspoken agendas. That way you won't be so easily seduced by them. Now, Nietzsche told this famous parable of a madman who arrives in a town market with a lantern and he's crying out, "I seek God." And the market is filled at this point with a lot of unbelievers. That's what Germany was at that time. A lot of people had kind of given up on their faith. And so they just all start laughing at him. But the man continues, "Where is God? I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him." At this, the crowd kept silent, staring at the man in astonishment. And then the madman threw down his lantern, he shattered it on the ground, and he stormed out, saying, "I have come too early. My time has not yet reached the ears of man." And on the same day, that man went and visited many churches and sang a Requiem Aeternam Deo, which translates as a eternal rest to God. It's like a dirge, a song that you sing after someone dies. And to those who asked him to explain himself, he replied, "What are the churches now if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of God?" Okay, now Nietzsche wasn't suggesting that God had formerly existed, but now we've killed him. His point rather was that by rejecting belief in God, we have destroyed the philosophical foundations for all the things that we take to be meaningful and important. Beliefs, for example, in the soul and the afterlife, I mean, these are sort of quasi-religious concepts. You can understand why those have to be tossed out. But then even something like selfhood, or maybe I should say personal identity. This is something that David Hume had pointed out. Why do we believe in some kind of ongoing self? If you look at a photograph of yourself from when you were just born or when you were a child, you'll probably notice that it looks a lot different from what you look like today. And that's because, at least in terms of the material properties, it's all very different, right? In fact, all of the cells in your body have been replaced. So on a cellular level, you're a totally different thing than you were when you were born. And so if we don't have some kind of unifying principle, some basis for believing in an ongoing self, like for example a soul, then why should we even believe in an ongoing self? So the concept of selfhood or personal identity needs to be thrown out. What about human dignity? Why do we believe that human beings have some kind of special dignity over a set of headphones or a rock or a lizard? According to the Bible, humans were specially created in God's image. That was understood to imply that humans had some kind of inherent dignity above and beyond other creatures and material objects. But if we're not going to believe in God anymore, and all that we have left is the material world, then what sense does it make to say that humans have some kind of inherent dignity above other creatures or even above other material objects? I mean, from a materialistic standpoint, from an empirical standpoint, they're really just different configurations of atoms or particles, right? Here's one configuration that we call headphones, another that we call a lizard, another that we call a rock, another that we call a human. If matter is the ultimate metaphysical reality, then what is there that differentiates or makes us think that humans have some kind of special dignity above and beyond these other things? Okay, so human dignity needs to be thrown out. How about concepts of good and evil? If there is no ultimate basis of good, such as, I don't know, the character of God, then how do we come up with a standard for goodness without being arbitrary? Or again, if there is no God and we can't rely on divine revelation to tell us anything, then is there any objective truth that we can discover? If everything that we know is known through our senses and reason, then how can we get outside of our own minds, our own experiences, and sort of grab hold on anything external, anything that's not ultimately perceived and defined subjectively? We like to think that reason can help us to be more objective and open-minded, but if everything, including human behavior, can be reduced to irrational and purposeless physical processes, electrochemical reactions or what have you, then even our rational faculties aren't what we think they are. At best, in other words, when they're not acting totally irrationally, people seem to be driven by animalistic instincts and just choose to believe and do things because they think it's in their best interest, and then they seek to impose their will on others. Reason is just a pretext, a subterfuge, a ploy, a gimmick. That's the hard truth of atheism. But the point of Nietzsche's parable is that people haven't come to terms with this yet. They haven't appreciated the full implications of their atheism. They will eventually. In the meantime, though, they're all just living as self-deluded animals. This should be obvious to anyone who has read Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. Darwin showed that we humans are really nothing more than hairless apes. He says, formerly, that is before Darwin, one sought the feeling of the grandeur of man by pointing to his divine origin. This has now become a forbidden way, for at its portal, at its opening, stands the ape, together with other gruesome beasts, grinning knowingly, as if to say, no further in this direction. The theory of evolution has profound implications for how we understand morality, or at least it should. If we've all just evolved from other animals, then we need to understand human nature and things like morality, which is kind of an expression of our human nature, in relation to the other animals. We should therefore try to understand it as an instinctual drive. So ask yourself, what is it that really drives the animals? Darwin has shown that it is the will to survive, the will to propagate, the will to overcome, the will to dominate, the will to power. And this instinct plays itself out in every aspect of our lives, including the ways that we formulate and understand morality. Yes, even morality is ultimately nothing more than an expression of our will to power. Nietzsche explored this question in his book On the Genealogy of Morality, and here he was especially fixated on showing the flaws in Christian notions of morality, but his criticisms could just as well be applied to other popular notions of morality. So in this book, he asks certain questions. He tries to answer them. He asks, how did our notions of morality arise? How do they function? Which kinds of morality are life-affirming and which are life-denying? On the question of origins, we have to understand that morality didn't emerge from within a vacuum. It emerged from within a certain political context. And often it was in the context of a conflict, some situation where one group of people was dominating another group of people. The earliest forms of morality, and when I say morality here, I'm talking about like notions about the good, the virtuous, and so on. These earliest forms of morality emphasize things like skill, the attainment of power and wealth, self-assertiveness, domination, and so on. Now, you can imagine that there would have only been a small percentage of people within society who would have stood to benefit from this kind of value system. So in order to cope with their servile state of existence, the disenfranchised masses got creative, and they came up with their own value systems, their own forms of morality. And so now they would stand to benefit most from this moral system. Okay, so let's take a closer look at these two different value systems. You've got the master morality and the slave or the herd morality. The master morality is represented by such people as Achilles, the Greek hero of Homer's Iliad, and then the Romans. Here's a depiction on the Arch of Titus of the Roman army carrying into the city of Rome all the spoils of war that they had gotten after defeating the Jews in 70 AD. And then at the bottom, you've got Malcolm X, who says, anytime you tell a man to turn the other cheek or to be nonviolent in the face of a violent enemy, you're making that man defenseless. You're robbing him of his God-given right to defend himself. Okay, so these are representatives, you might say, of master morality. Now, the opposite of that, the slave or the herd morality, is really the inverse of the master morality. And so, for example, Jesus says, but I say unto you, love your enemies, bless those that curse you, do good to those that hate you, and pray for those who despitefully use you and persecute you. Or Gandhi says, the weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attitude of the strong. So it's the very opposite of what you might think. So that's why I say it's like an inversion, right? And so Martin Luther King, you might contrast his approach with Malcolm X. I mean, Nietzsche died long before these two men were even born, so he never made this contrast himself, but I think he would have seen them as good representatives of these two different moral perspectives. Okay, so let's try to elaborate a bit on what Nietzsche saw as the characteristic features of these two very different moral perspectives. Master morality affirms one's bestial nature, and it affirms a vigorous pursuit of success in life, and it values such things as self-confidence, freedom, glory, triumph, excellence, those sorts of things. Slave or herd morality, on the other hand, denies and suppresses one's bestial nature. It favors behaviors and attitudes that help to alleviate the suffering of the weak and raise them from their low positions in life. It values things like justice, pity, sympathy, kindness, selflessness, humility, altruism. It seeks to level all distinctions among humans, It really latches on to the idea of justice, and it does so at the expense of things like greatness, achievement, excellence, creativity, and competitiveness. Now, Nietzsche asks how these two different moral perspectives might have emerged and how they were designed to function. The origins and function of the master morality seem pretty straightforward. This type of morality must have originated in a competitive context in which these rulers were able to excel. Its function was therefore to make the rulers feel good about their accomplishments and provide them with further opportunities to excel. The origins of the slave class morality are more complex. It originated out of feelings of resentment toward the master class. It was introduced as a kind of slave revolt against the ruler class. These slaves were basically trying to rationalize their weak and impoverished state. So they defined as their values things that better matched their own personalities and states of existence. They also introduced a new idea, evil. Master morality focused mainly on the values of good and bad, not those of right and wrong. For the rulers, things like dominion, wealth, success, and excellence were all obviously good things. Conversely, things like slavery, poverty, failure, and humiliation were bad things. But slave class morality now began to evaluate behaviors and states of existence in terms of right and wrong. And since the slaves saw themselves as being in the right, they had to invert the whole value system of their rulers and turn them into the baddies.
Very well. They're coming. Now we'll see how these Russians deal with a crack SS division.
Hans?
Have courage, my friend.
Yeah. Hans, I've just noticed something.
These communists are all cowards.
Have you looked at our caps recently?
Our caps?
The badges on our caps. Have you looked at them?
What? No. A bit?
They've got skulls on them. Have you noticed that our caps have actually got little pictures of skulls on them?
I don't,
Hans, are we the baddies?
Okay, so to reiterate, what happened was the members of the master class came up with a system of values that suited their own qualities and behaviors. The members of the slave class then became really resentful about their situation and retaliated against the master class by introducing their own system of values, a system that better suited their own qualities and behaviors and furthermore made the members of the master class look bad and immoral. In addition to this, the slaves aligned themselves with God, who they said would punish anyone who violates their standards of morality. So, in other words, if you're on our side, you're on God's side. If you're on their side, following their system of values, you may be able to live it up for the moment, but you'll get your comeuppance one way or the other, either in this life or the next. Okay, so let's look at some of the virtues and values that one is likely to find within each of these two systems of morality. Ruler class morality would emphasize things like boldness and self-confidence, whereas slave class morality would emphasize humility and promote that as an important virtue. Courage and daring for the ruler class versus carefulness and wisdom for the slave class. Amassment of wealth versus sacrifice, self-imposed poverty. Sexual conquest versus chastity. Power, assertiveness versus self-restraint, passivity. Resoluteness versus forgiveness. Honor versus subordination. Luxuriousness versus modesty. In ruler class morality, it's of course the rulers and the victors who are most esteemed, whereas in the slave class morality, it's the slaves and the oppressed who are most esteemed. In ruler class morality, a list of ideals would include such things as the enjoyment of pleasure, merit, achievement, outspokenness, being healthy and strong. Whereas in slave class morality, it's the very opposite. It would include such things as self-denial, equity, fairness, kindness, and collegiality, being frail and suffering. Now, according to Nietzsche, slave morality is really just a coping device. The members of the slave class can feel good about their weaknesses and ineptitude because they've somehow twisted their own failures into virtues. So let's go back and look at some of these things on the list here. Humility is considered to be a virtue by those who are members of the slave class. But what is humility? Well, you might see humility as kind of a cloak or a mask for a person's lack of self-confidence or unwillingness to take risks in life. So humility, upon closer analysis, could just be seen as a deficiency in the person's character. Or let's look at chastity. So somebody decides that he or she is going to live a chaste life, no sex, right? Well, that might be regarded as a virtue among members of the slave class, but the members of the ruling class would perhaps look at that with derision and say something like, well, of course you're choosing that type of lifestyle. I mean, you never were very good with women. Or, you were terrible at relationships. So again, upon closer analysis, we find that this supposed virtue, chastity, is really just another mask for the person's deficiencies. Forgiveness. This may seem like a virtue, but what if it too was just a mask that people hide behind because the power structure is such that even if they wanted to, they wouldn't actually be able to avenge themselves anyway? Okay, and modesty, another example. What is modesty? Modesty is just another mask. So you're living this very modest life, are you? Not displaying your wealth, not bragging about yourself. But that's just because you haven't really made much money and you haven't really accomplished anything in life. So once again, your supposed virtue is really just a cover for your own deficiencies. All right, and slave morality is also self-serving, no less so than master morality. Slaves benefit if their masters are expected to abide by the principles of justice. Justice is something that helps to equalize power, right? So if the slaves don't have any power of their own, it's to their advantage to have some principle of justice operating within society. The weak also benefit if they are given special treatment, special favors and accommodations. The unadventurous, risk-averse, order-following masses will stand to benefit if those who are enterprising and creative, those who take risks and break new ground, are taught to share their ideas and share their wealth with others. Okay, so as you can tell, Nietzsche despised herd morality, partly because of its dishonesty. He called it the counterfeit and self-deception of impotence. Underneath the garb of virtue lies the same lust for power that animates the master class. In the weak, justice conceals the feeble grasping for their fair share. Patience is nothing more than simmering resentment, and love cloaks hatred. Nietzsche decries the duplicity involved in enshrining humility and selflessness while secretly desiring power. The value beneath the value, beneath the herd virtues, is the non-moral quest for domination. What is called good depends on whose interests are at stake. From the perspective of the weak, domination is wicked. From the perspective of the strong, however, it is good. Now, don't misconstrue Nietzsche here. He wasn't advocating for some kind of crude, might makes right form of morality. True master morality is not an inherited privilege. It's something that requires active discipline and conquest. Masters thrive on competition and therefore need genuine challenges. So here we might contrast someone like Achilles with Nero Caesar. From a political standpoint, Nero Caesar was a ruler, but he was really in that slave type of morality. Achilles actively avenged his friend's death, and he courageously defeated Hector. Nero, on the other hand, passively inherited his wealth and power by being an heir to the throne, and then he lived an undisciplined and unaccomplished life. So just because you're in a position of power and privilege, that doesn't mean that you are living according to this master morality. Masters seek to overcome even their own weaknesses. To do this, they will voluntarily subject themselves to strict discipline. Now, Nietzsche refers to this discipline as a kind of asceticism. Asceticism is usually associated with practices like fasting, not sleeping, living out in the elements, ascending a flight of steps covered with rice on your knees, and so on. Now, you might think that Nietzsche wouldn't approve of any kind of asceticism because he was always emphasizing life-affirming practices, right? But that's a little too simplistic because in order to pursue life with full vigor, you often have to exercise discipline. There's a big difference, though, according to Nietzsche, between the ascetic practices of someone in the master class and those that would be adopted by someone in the slave or the herd class. People in the master class would pursue ascetic practices so that they can attain their lofty goals. So, exercise, good study habits, abstaining from social media and fast food, things like that. Whereas the ascetic practices of those in the slave class only serve to abase people. So things like self-flagellation, vows of silence, renunciation of property, living on the top of pillars, which is something that some early Christians used to do, attaching a ball and chain to your leg, something else that some early Christians did, standing for 40 days during Lent, another early Christian practice. These are all ascetic practices that are not life-affirming. They only serve to abase a person. Okay, so that's pretty much all I have to say about Nietzschean morality. I've referred to it as nihilism, although some would dispute whether Nietzsche was, in fact, a moral nihilist. I think that he was, though. He wrote a book called Beyond Good and Evil, precisely because he didn't believe in good and evil. He thought that these are just invented ideas. People in the ruling class create their own system of morals, and those in the slave class do the same thing. So everyone's just creating their own values. There's no objective standard. It's all just perspectival, and everyone just adopts the values that best suit their personalities and self-interests. So yeah, I do think that Nietzsche would qualify as a moral nihilist. In fact, I don't see how he could be described as anything other than this.